Thank you, Charles, and thank you again for the invite to be part of this conversation. As you indicated during the introduction, I'm more going to draw from my, several decades of working in the sector and being part of the southern, whatever we call southern countries. And so, as you said, I'm going to be talking about common pitfalls that we often observe when we are in this part of the world. It's not to point out at any mistakes or anything, point fingers at anyone, but it's really to provoke some reflection and more thinking about what sometimes good intentions end up achieving, and to encourage, I think, more engagement and investment of more time as more funders think about this subject. And in a sense, deciding what is progressive and who is making that kind of judgment. And also, I'll focus on just picking a few examples because we just have 5 minutes to talk about this. And one of the first area I want to talk about is what I'm calling proximity and maybe its relevance. And of course, many of us are familiar with the fact that in trying to understand new contexts, many funders have traditionally opened offices in Global South, and they'll get staff. Of course, over the years, the number of expatriates have become lesser and lesser, as we call them. And very many countries actually are headed by people from the South, in that effort to, to kind of really be as relevant as possible. But as we often observe, you'll find the structures, the systems, the sort of data that you often are required to provide, choosing programs, etc., is really focused, many times it is really focused on meeting the needs, of whoever the funder is. And so very often, even when we end up with offices in these countries, we end up with staffing, whether local or whatever. In some ways, it actually becomes more of what is visible. It's more of what is an outward way of looking at it. But when you interrogate the inside, actually, in terms of what is happening, you'll actually realize that a lot of this, and not much has actually changed, if I may put it more bluntly. And there isn't a lot of flexibility in actually dealing with the difficulties or the challenges that are often experienced, even maybe by partners. So that lack of flexibility or ability to adjust either what was planned or how one wants to work is a real issue that we often observe. And very often it is not uncommon to find funders leaving a very well-intentioned, community or partner, because there wasn't the time to nurture or build on the goodwill that is existing, to sort of build and build the organization. I think some of the previous panelists have talked about the need to invest in building. That commitment to nurture is often not always there. And so I just want to say, even when we aim at being close to where these operations are coming, without a real serious in-depth look at what is happening, you may actually not be as progressive as one might wish was happening. Another area I want to pick about very shortly is the local mindsets. And I think some of the previous panelists have mentioned, because of what has happened over the years, the mindset of many communities has been set to kind of expect resources to come from somewhere else. And it's very rare that you find funders who are willing to invest in helping mobilize, helping grow that capacity, genuinely helping grow the capacity to mobilize. So there is a mindset that if you can see all these well-set premises and high-end sort of vehicles, etc., the resources come from there. So very often the action of funders ends up building that mentality that actually we can't do these things ourselves. We need somebody, and that person has to be someone from outside who has to. And in the end, we end up with funders, because of the way they act and behave, building that, or rather continuing to build that mentality that actually locals don't have. They can't do it, and The more people are depressed, the more they end up acting with that mentality. And so when you go out to actually find out what's happening or what can be done, many times you'll find that the programs that are emerging are actually what locals read of what the funder would have funded, not necessarily what they really would have liked. So the mindset is a big challenge if one doesn't invest in really understanding where people are. And even the kind of acting in ignorance often leads to, the determination of programs that are not necessarily what really people would have needed, because people have not quite understood what actually is going on here. What is the mentality? There isn't time for building that relationship of trust, which I think has been mentioned. So in the end, very often the dynamics, the ways of working ends up contributing to enhancing that mindset of actually we can't do it, as opposed to creating ways of actually building confidence that is needed. Another area is the power dynamics, whether you're talking about local or international staff. Having staff that are not aware about the kind of power they wield because they are working in a poor environment where money is needed, where people need resources. When you act with that ignorance about whether knowing how you come across, who you are, what you represent, and then having an organizational culture that necessarily does not build this kind of confidence and freedom to communicate at a trust level, these things don't help. We have had a lot of effort or rather there's been a lot of initiatives that talk about localization. It's the buzzword, shifting the power. But the question is, what actually is localization? And maybe we've had some ideas this afternoon for where I am. But actually, I just want to say from what we have observed in this part, language, changing the documents, adopting the kind of language which makes one look like they are progressive in itself does not really change much. And those are documents that can be produced by anyone. But the real change to really be progressive, I want to suggest in the interest of time, that it really requires a very serious internal reflection. And I'm happy I've had a bit of that mentioned, actually quite a bit of that mentioned. An organization-wide deep change or deep reflection on actually what have we been doing? What have we been up to? What has worked well? And answering these kind of questions, what needs to change? Looking at the internal operating system structures, the kind of things you insist for yourself, and looking, if we really want to be progressive, which of these things do we need to change? I think critically looking at these questions are really important as part of being a progressive funder. Exploring what is an organizational culture that our teams, whether local or international, would kind of operate within. I think this is so critical when you are operating in very poor environments. If you don't reflect on what is the culture, and we on the ground are the ones who experience, it's one thing to say it at different levels, but the people on the ground, we see how these people carry themselves around and the kind of things that are passed on and how they are passed on. I think exploring whether the organizational culture is really suitable for a progressive funder, I want to suggest is something that requires attention. And I also recognize that these are not easy changes for big organizations, big funders, big institutions, and that for this kind of changes to happen, it has to be intentional, it has to be supported. And organization-wide means what the top is saying is the same as what's happening on the ground. So I just want to end by saying we really have to invest in both the hardware and the software to make the kind of changes that would really reflect being a progressive funder. Thank you.